Well, this is the second of 4 statutory reports which are investigating how children were treated by clergy, in the broader sense of the word. I mean, we've had the Ferns report in 2005, which looked at the abuse of children by priests in Ferns diocese. This Commission into Child Abuse report is looking at the abuse of children in institutions run by 18 religious congregations. These are congregations of nuns, or Sisters of Mercy, Sisters of Charity, etc., of brothers, Christian brothers and Presentation brothers, and of priests in the Oblate fathers who ran Dangan, and the Rosminian fathers who ran a number of industrial schools, namely in Cork and Tipperary. Of course, we have the Dublin inquiry to come, which is looking at abuse by priests in the Dublin Archdiocese area, and the Cloyne inquiry to come, which will look at the abuse by priests in Cloyne Diocese. But by any stretch of whatever, this report published today is enormous and will not be equalled by the reports to come or by Ferns, which we had already. It's 3,000 pages in length. It's a 5-volume report. It's been in train or been prepared for the best part of 10 years. The actual commission was set up administratively in 1999, May 1999 as it happens, and statutorily in May of 2000. So effectively it's been sitting for 9 years, mainly in private session. Approximately 800 people who've been in these institutions gave evidence before the commission in private session mainly, and the various representatives of the religious congregations were also interviewed mainly in private sessions, though there were some public sessions which I reported on myself for the paper up to 2006. Parallel with that, the Confidential Committee, which is another of the 2 arms of the Commission, you had the Investigation Committee and the Confidential Committee. It was like a truth forum where people could voluntarily come along and tell their story and have it recorded without, in a totally informal context, without being identified and without the alleged abusers being identified either. And over 1,000 people gave evidence to the Confidential Committee, which on the basis of what it heard made recommendation to the Commission, and the Commission took those into consideration in making the recommendations it published today. The findings are extraordinary by any measure. It found that physical abuse led to a climate of fear which was created by pervasive, excessive and arbitrary punishment which permeated most of the institutions and all of those run for boys. And that children lived, to use the phrase, it's from the report, with the daily terror of not knowing where the next beating was coming from. It is the major consistent factor throughout all the evidence. Something like 90% of people who spoke to this commission talked about physical abuse. But most shocking of all, even for somebody like myself who covered the public hearings, was the finding that sexual abuse was endemic in boys' institutions. And where it did exist in girls' institutions, it wasn't really systematic and tended to be abused by employees of the institutions which are run by men, by nuns, or by people that were sent out to for temporary foster type arrangement. And that finding of endemic sexual abuse of boys is shocking in 2 ways. One, it involved members of staff running the institutions, and it seems to be a consistent pattern that every institution had some of these paedophiles, either singly at times. One man actually was known to be a paedophile and was 14 years in one institution. Or there were numbers of them, up to 3 at a time in another particular institution. And also there was abuse of younger boys, sexual abuse of younger boys by older boys in a lot of the institutions as well. What is presented here is an outrageous picture of the way the kids in these institutions were treated in this state throughout most of the 20th century. And even more outrageous, this was known by the religious congregations at the very highest level. It was known by the state authorities at the very highest level, and a blind eye was turned. The Commission does not accept explanations from the religious orders that they didn't understand the nature of the abuse that was going on, particularly sexual abuse. They produce evidence to counter that, and do point out, for instance, that criminal investigations were initiated when the religious congregations found out that laymen had been abusing kids, lay staff members. But when it came to members of the congregations themselves, this was not disclosed to the Gardaí or the civil authorities at all. They dealt with it internally, if they dealt with it at all, usually by shifting people around, a pattern that has become all too familiar where this issue is concerned and the church is concerned in a wider context. It also found that claims by the religious that they didn't have the resources to run these institutions don't stand up. In fact, they ran them in their own interests in the main. They've compared the system in the UK, which got rid of a lot of the bigger institutions in the 1920s period and replaced them with smaller family-type settings, which had a far better record, and is quickly realised that they had a far better record when it came to the care of children over there. Here, that wasn't even attempted. The bigger institutions were sustained. They were funded through capitation grants. The congregations actively sought and recruited numbers of children. This is in the report. Because they wanted to have high numbers of children to run these institutions, because it made it profitable. The state would pay per child that was in the institution, as well as that the children were supplying most of the labour in both the boys and the girls' institutions, even to the degree of older children, particularly in the girls' institutions, looking after smaller children in the institutions, cutting down on staff costs. So they were profitable, rather than not having enough resources. Yet at the same time, there is consistent findings of undernourishment where the children are concerned, that the food, when it was there, was inedible, that their clothing was hugely and wholly inadequate, with boys out working all day, out, usually on the land in some of these places, wearing the same clothes, even if they were wet, throughout the rest of the day, what clothes they had. Accommodation is described as Spartan and bleak in all of the institutions. I mean, the picture is relentless and unforgiving and accurate. I mean, it's sustained by evidence, documentary evidence or whatever provided to the Commission itself. As regards its implications, well, it has made major recommendations of what has to happen in the whole area of childcare in this country, with an emphasis on regulation, not just on guidelines, because the Department of Education in the past and the religious congregations themselves ignored all their own guidelines when it came to the care of these children and the disciplining of these children. That all the rules, nobody paid a blind bit of heed. So the emphasis in one of its main recommendations from the Commission is that regulation and inspection, and arbitrary inspection, unannounced inspection, has to be a major feature of childcare in this country from now on. They also talk about setting up a major memorial to all the children who are through these institutions. And, for instance, I could just give you an idea, between 1938 and 1978, in that 40-year period, approximately 25,000 children were recommended or put into these institutions by the courts, by the state. It also, I mean, I should say, in criticising the Department of Education, it talks about the deference, the excessive deference of the department to the religious congregations all along, and how really the state allowed itself to be little more than a facilitator for the demands of the managers of these institutions, and that it just let them do what they liked.